Salama Ashalanore, all. Welcome to a Gene Apologetics podcast. The audio may be mediocre in here because I'm in the road, and not in the road, thankfully, I'm actually on the road. And I'm recording this because I actually have quite a long commute to and fro all of my work. And so instead of wasting that time listening to old classic Arabic songs from the 90s, I figured I could do a little lecture-style presentation here. So why don't you guys sit back and relax? This is going to be a very chilled-out episode of Gene Apologetics. Again, forgive the road noise. There's literally nothing I can do. The road is a kafir, and I cannot excommunicate it. So today we're going to be discussing some of the basics of philosophy. We're going to go over the following, some in brief and some much longer. The Epicureans, Stoics, aka Stoicism, Platonism in the classical period, and Platonism in the middle period, known as Middle Platonism. Neoplatonism, that's right, the Plotinian boogeyman will be mentioned. And then we will also discuss Aristotelian metaphysics, logic, and philosophy. Allow me to just open up my book while driving, officer, but not without taking my eyes off the road, of course. Okay, let's see what we got here. Alright, I'm going to read you some of the notes that I've taken, and this is from a book, well, not from, but these are my abbreviations and notes from a book I was reading on ancient Christianity, or perhaps early Christianity, the influence of philosophy, and how the linguistics of philosophy were utilized by some of the, quote, apologists. Now, when we say apologists, we do not necessarily mean the ante-Nicene Fathers. So you have the apostolic age, which is the age directly after Christ ascends, and we have the apostles themselves, like Peter and Paul. Then, of course, we have, in that same age, the people who come from those apostles, such as Polycarp from the Apostle John, and so on. And then, of course, you have the ante-Nicene Fathers, who take place a little after this immediate apostolic age. And then you have the Nicene Fathers and the post-Nicene Fathers, which are the church fathers through the first few ecumenical councils, and then into the later councils, and then anything after that, I would not really say is a church father. So anything that's like getting into the 600s-700s, it's not really church father at that moment. That's a very, very long time after the New Testament has already been A, canonized, and B, the events already took place. When we look at the distinction between the East and the Western churches, before we get started, we see that the Western churches pre-schism, and not just 900s, but like early time pre-schism. So in the first few centuries, the Western churches, what you would call the Latin West, was much more rigid than the East and much less refined. The East was the one using, or the East were the ones, that were utilizing philosophy. They understood Platonism. They understood Aristotelian philosophy. They understood Stoicism and Epicureanism, although very few of them would have obviously been using Epicureanism. And it was the West that were taking things, I don't want to say more literally, but more simply. And that's not a bad thing. For anybody watching this who's a die-hard ortho bro or something, there's nothing wrong with stating that the West perhaps had a different, more humble, more direct route toward theology than the East did in the first couple of centuries. Again, not saying they're better, but they maybe had a more direct route. And remember, if you're truly Orthodox, the West is part of the heritage of Orthodoxy as well. We are not just Greeks and Byzantines and Georgians and Slavs and Bulgarians and Romanians and strange Semites who lecture from their car after work. You know, we as the Orthodox take the West as the heritage as well for the first 1,000 years. So it's not, Catholicism versus Orthodoxy. It's Western Orthodoxy versus Eastern Mediterranean Orthodoxy, just on terms of philosophy. So when you had people like Tertullian and Irenaus, they applauded the simple believers, and they were cautious of the overuse of philosophy. Meanwhile, in the East, you had such figures as Origen and Clement as such examples. They believed that Christians could be separated into essentially two groups: the faithful religious, who were the faithful who didn't know that much about philosophy, what some would say sophistry, and really deep analytical theology, Rather, they just knew the faith, they practiced their religion, and they were applauded. And that was the first type. Those were much more applauded in the West, whereas people like Origen and Clement almost looked down on this first group because they believed in these Christians who had come into faith more through Gnosis. And no, this is not Gnosticism. I know somebody's going to chime in and say, oh, he used the word knowledge, ergo it's Gnosticism. This is a generic word that can be used outside of the confines of Gnosticism. And so they believed that this Gnosis group would be a higher type of Christian who knew philosophy, and they would unravel the deeper meaning of revealed scripture via the philosophical leanings. And so the East, / you could even say some of the Greek fathers, disparaged this lack of Gnosis among some of the people in the West, and they thought that the more privileged, or as they thought the Gnosis or higher class of Christians, had a more privileged position by God. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we get into the philosophy, that the Eastern Mediterranean, the first couple centuries, was very, very philosophical, probably too philosophical. And that does not mean that's an attack on orthodoxy. Again, the West is part of the heritage of orthodoxy. You got to lose this idea that East is always best. That's not how it works. We like the pre-schism West on this platform. That is exactly what we believe. Another quick note before we get into the philosophy. I've mentioned the immortal / eternal soul that I've brought up many times on my channel. In fact, I'm starting to turn into the soul guy because everybody knows me by that at some point. The immortal soul was taught by Pythagoras in the 6th century BC. He's probably the first one to ever coin the term and to really believe in it. So he believes the soul pre-exists the body, that it is indestructible by nature and eternal by nature. None of those things have anything to do with the biblical idea of the soul, called the nephesh in Hebrew, the psyche in the Greek, and not to do with orthodoxy or Catholicism either. This eternal, uncreated, indestructible soul that is like part of God. We don't believe in that. We have Aristides, 2nd century, taught that all of the pagan gods were emanations of the one supreme God. So that's where we're going to start, because we're going to look at how the Olympian, low-level, highly urban, what I'm going to call high polytheism, turned into syncretism, and then that turned into vague deistic monotheism. And so that's the general movement of the Greeks away from traditional high polytheism. High polytheism being this cosmopolitan, mainly urban endeavor of all of these different gods coming together as one. You may, when I'm describing this, think of Islam with their reports of how in Mecca their leader Muhammad saw how all the gods were together at the Kaaba. But that's not unusual. That is exactly what pagans did in urban centers. And quick note, if anybody argues monotheism is a late development, that's wrong. The original superstitious beliefs of the first people who believed in some kind of supernatural theology, if you could call it theology, believed in an abstract, generic monotheism. High polytheism with its hundreds of different gods is not some rural backwater thing that was invented in the desert. It is the culmination of cosmopolitan invitation. So that's one thing to remember with Aristides that I just mentioned. Plutarch as well syncretizes pagan lore with a perfect, supreme deity. And this is where the idea of pantheos or pantheism is going to start to come in. That will be covered in another episode or maybe another podcast. Emperor Aurelian institutes Sol Invictus, his one universal, quote, Godhead, known by many names in 274 AD. So see how we're starting to get this syncretism, where even after the time of Christianity, and some of them before the time of Christianity, are moving away from high polytheism into this generic deistic syncretism, and then into just deistic monotheism, where they're moving away from traditional paganism. That's why the Orthodox and the Catholic churches both justify utilizing the jargon of philosophy, in that the Greeks were already moving toward monotheism and they had not even been given any revealed scripture. So it is God's will that they would move away from high polytheism, and this philosophy helped them to do that. But of course, that has to have some kind of a line in the sand, where philosophy can only go so far, and we can't say, well, the Greeks are moving towards monotheism, so they're inerrant and everything they taught is good, and we're going to quote Ammonius Saccas more than we're going to quote any of the prophets in the law. Well, that's wrong. because the Bible comes first. Orthodoxy and Catholicism are prima scriptura, the scripture first before all else. Then there's the tradition, and within the tradition, there's scripture, analytics, and philosophy. The philosophy part has to always be the last priority. That is how you keep this religion from becoming some kind of a man-made endeavor. Apuleius, I might be mispronouncing that because my notes were so rushed, he said that the goddess Isis, of course coming from mainly from Egypt, is, quote, the chieftess of the heavenly ones, the inclusive manifestation of gods and goddesses, whose unique divinity and the world adores by manifold forms. So see how, even though this is clearly pagan polytheism, there's now a greater goddess, who all the other gods are just emanations of this one goddess. See how we're moving away from high polytheism, where there's just like a bunch of gods, and I like Zeus, well, I like Poseidon. Or really, I'm from Italy, so we call him Neptune. And it's just all a bunch of meaningless local jibber-jabber that has nothing to do with proper theology. We'll discuss Manichaeanism very quickly because it is relevant when we're going to look at Platonism and Neoplatonism. So man is lost in darkness and separated from the transcendental world. He's a fragment of light trapped in the material world. So the material world is inferior to this upper realm world. Remember that, because that is one of the great errors of some of the Hellenic philosophers, assuming that the material world is inferior, and some would even say downright evil, especially looking at you, Plotinus. So he's trapped in the material world. He's a fragment of light trapped in the material world. He's the same essence as God. Humans are fragments of divine substance. Salvation is through knowledge, being illuminated from the dark. Matter is evil, Manichaeism. Contamination of the flesh. So it's a really, really high version. Hang on. It's a really high version of dualistic extremism. So dualism versus holism, real quick. Holism is that, man is one. And even if we're a composite, that composite is a perfect unity. Don't start bringing the Miaphysites into this. So that is the kind of language they use. A little underhand joke there. But, we are a composite of body and soul. That's what the Bible teaches. And that's what most of the church teaches. Some people have made errors on that, but for the most part have not really leapt into the extreme dualism of Manichaeanism and Greek philosophy, where the soul is the primary faculty. You are the soul and the body's an afterthought. Well, that's nonsense. That comes from paganism. The Bible doesn't teach that you are the soul and your body's an afterthought. When God addresses where he searches man for the faculty of his consciousness, he actually says the physical heart, the physical brain, and the physical kidney. And yes, that may just be the cultural explanation of the Jews at that time, but this is still inerrant scripture. So that wouldn't be wrong. So God allows us to understand that we have a physical faculty in God searching who we are. It's still down to a physical level. Not everything is like a ghost eternal soul. Please remember that. That's very important. So dualism is, you got the soul, and then you got the body, and they're totally different, and one of them is superior to the other. Then you got the light, and you got the darkness, you got the material world, and the immaterial world. This is dualism. Dualism has way too high of an influence on the West. Now, we're going to look at skepticism, which is not the same as a modern atheist being a skeptic. That's with a K, this is with a C. Skepticism, any dogmatism they taught, is bad. It's useless and it's impossible to get knowledge using any kind of dogmatic theology or philosophy. They suspended rationality. So that's all we'll talk about skepticism for now. I'm trying to get through these so I can get to the meatier stuff. Epicureanism, the gods or God, is not concerned with human affairs. Reality is composed of an infinity of atoms in a void. Sensation is the criterion of good and evil. So the criterion of good and evil is sensation. It's not philosophy, it's not some secret kind of knowledge, and whatever god/gods there are in the Epicurean culture, or wherever this culture is, and someone happens to be an Epicurean, they're not concerned with the affairs of man. So God is this distant, almost like a clockmaker, who does not care about the affairs of mankind, does not intervene, and does not really judge them. Now we're going to get into Plato. So this will be important. We go to Plato. He lived between, I believe, 429 to 374 BC. And Plato gave us a theory of knowledge. Knowledge is possible, he stated, but cannot be obtained through sense perception. Transcendental world of form/ideas, which are apprehended by intellect alone. So he has this idea of form/ideas. So they can kind of be called either as transcendental world, which are apprehended by intellect alone. Sensation gives us great numbers of particular objects which are constantly changing. The mind seizes on certain characteristics which groups of them have in common and are stable. So we have sensation, we have the transcendentals, okay, and we have this world of form/ideas. Transcendentalism is huge. It's something that we need to talk about later in this episode. So as I said, the mind seizes certain characteristics which groups of them have in common and are stable. Some examples would be, oh man, they keep closing these lanes around here. It's insufferable. President Bidet, i.e. forms of beauty in itself and likeness in itself. The forms resemble universals. For Plato, they had objective existence. So forms/ideas actually existed as their own inherent ontological existence. That is not what other philosophies teach. So remember, this is something that's quite novel that Plato has introduced, that forms and ideas have an ontological existence, an objective existence. Forms are categorized in an arranged hierarchy, crowned by the most universal form of all, the form of the good. The good would later be called the one in, I think, Middle Platonism, and then of course in Neoplatonism. So we have this hierarchy, and the greatest of them, the most universal form of all, is called the form of the good, or again later the one, which is the cause of all other forms and our knowledge of them. So he's not just the cause, but he's also the cause of the knowledge we have concerning them. So knowledge is an important thing in the theory of knowledge, obviously, that Plato is discussing here. Forms are eternal, unchanging, truly real. They transcend the world of particular, sensible things. So remember that. Forms are eternal, they're unchanging, and they have an objective existence in and of themselves. They're not just descriptions of things, but are themselves a thing. Not just a mirror of a thing, but an actual thing. The categories are themselves the things. The world of becoming, Plato teaches, is modeled on the world of forms, and particulars are only what they are so far as the forms participate in or are copied by them. So remember the world of becoming. We'll get into much more specificities on all of this in later podcasts, but this is just an explanation of exactly what Platonism is. Souls. Now remember, Pythagoras, 6th century BC, he's the first one to talk about this immaterial, immortal, eternal, indestructible soul, pre-existed the body, will exist after the body, is superior to the body, taught by Pythagoras. So now we're on Plato. Souls are immaterial, immortal by nature. So when we talk about immortality in the Orthodox Church, first of all, that is also referencing the physical body due to the eschaton and the resurrection. So very technically, the soul alone by itself is not going to be immortal because it will be reunited with the body to become that composite that we were talking about. So no longer, there isn't this concept of dualism in Orthodoxy. But either way, that soul, while it is in the immortal state and it is in paradise, is not immortal by nature. The immortality is a gift given by God. So it did not pre-exist. The soul never pre-exists the body. It was united with the body. That's why the Catholics will sometimes say, at one point during conception or pregnancy is a baby ensouled, meaning given its soul. But that doesn't mean the soul existed beforehand. The soul is created and immediately given to the child. Not this kind of Neoplatonic Islamic belief where souls are just always in heaven with Allah for some undetermined amount of time, and then they are selected a body and they come down, and then they have to return back to Allah when they die. You'll see that is clearly Neoplatonic in another podcast. Anyway, souls are immaterial, immortal by nature, pre-exist the body. They belong to the world of forms, not the world of becoming. They consist of three elements here. 1, a higher/rational element. which apprehends truths and directs man's life. 2, a spirited element, the seat of the nobler emotions. And 3, an appetitive element for carnal desires. The one, or the good, is not exactly God in Plato's thing, his philosophy. It's more like an ontological idea, not a personal deity who actually has opinions. Soul is the supreme directive/organizer. World soul animates the universe. And in Timaeus, Plato says the demiurge, which is identified with his world soul, crafts the world out of pre-existent material. So, first of all, we have this, and it's designed by the pattern the demiurge contemplates in the world of forms. So we have the demiurge/world soul. He and the world itself are independent. So we have two ultimate principles in addition to pre-existent matter, because the matter already existed before he had to craft anything. This is totally different from the Bible, where when you're reading the Church Fathers, I believe it's St. Justin Martyr who says that God creates ex nihilo. He creates out of nothing. Otherwise, if things always existed, he would be essentially the God of nothing, because he wouldn't be responsible for creating and crafting those things. So there's the belief that God actually created. It didn't just kind of erupt from the Big Bang. It was always there, and God just showed up one day and said, oh, what is all this pre-existent rock and molten lava doing here? I gotta make earth out of this. That's not how it's described in the Bible at all. You know, in the beginning there was just God, and then God made the heavens and the earth. Not in the beginning there was the heaven and the earth, which had some strange form, and then God made the earth. He made the heaven and the earth. Out of what? A different earth? No, out of nothing, from himself. But it doesn't mean the earth was inside him. It just means that he made it. End of story. No reason to sit around and overly contemplate on these issues. And now, we can discuss Aristotle. So today will be Plato and Aristotle. Not going to get into Neoplatonism or Stoicism right now. So remember, we've got the theory of knowledge from Plato. We have the universals who have an ontological existence. We have the worlds of form/ideas. Again, those have their own ontological/objective existence. We understand the universal or most supreme form is the form of the good, which we'll just call the one, because it is eventually called the one anyway. And he's the one through which all things come from. All forms and our knowledge of those forms come from the one. The forms are eternal, unchanging, and of course we're introduced to transcendentalism, immortal, immaterial, eternal soul, a la Pythagoras, and the tripartite understanding of the soul, which is higher rational element, spirited element, appetitive element, the demiurge, the world soul, exist together. Two ultimate principles in addition to this pre-existent matter, completely different from the Bible. So when Nietzsche says Christianity is Platonism for the masses, he's referring to later teaching being conflated with Platonic philosophy. Obviously, he would be incorrect. Hang on, this is so irritating. There. Obviously, he would be incorrect that the core teaching of the Bible is Platonism. So, I don't even know if that's what he was arguing. It doesn't matter. Unlike God, Nietzsche actually is dead, so who cares? On to Aristotle, the pupil of Plato. How does the mind think? In categories, according to Aristotle. Categories are substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, date, position, state, action, positivity. Those are the 10 categories in the Aristotelian metaphysical system, in his philosophy. These 10 represent also the mode in which all things exist in that world. The mode in which things exist in that world. Aristotle was a realist, unlike his mentor Plato. He accepted the reality of the material world. So it's not inaccurate to say that Aristotle was some kind of a materialist. I don't know if I would just say, hey, you like materialism, go do Aristotle's metaphysics, but he was definitely more realistic and perhaps more rational than Plato, and he didn't really accept the abstract over-exaggerations of transcendentals that are in Platonic philosophy. He criticized the Platonic theory of forms, and he criticized this idea in that they are separate or transcend particulars. Aristotle argues that they are present in particulars. So let's review that again real quick. Okay. So Plato says the forms transcend or are separate from particulars. Aristotle says that they are present within particulars. The individual substance is compound of subject, also called substratum, and the form. Body and soul are a composite unity. See how I was talking about the composite unity of body and soul in accordance to orthodoxy? this is definitely more rational than what Plato and Pythagoras were saying, and Socrates, on this nonsensical, eternal, indestructible, pre-existent Platonic soul, or Pythagorean soul, really. So we don't just say, oh, Aristotle's right, we got to follow everything he does, but he happens to get this right. The body and soul composite is closer to the truth than the nonsensical dualism craziness of Manichaeism, and unfortunately Platonic philosophy also has that. Does not mean all of Platonic philosophy is garbage, by the way. I'm just pointing out the inconsistencies, and you'll see that there are no philosophers that can 100% be used to justify Christianity. Only elements of them. The body is matter to the soul, and the soul is form to the body. We're still on Aristotle. Soul is immortal. Oh, here we go. Self-moving, the source of motion and change in all that is not soul. So see, now we can't believe some things in Aristotle. He goes a little too far. So he's mentioning immortality of the soul. I assume he means immortal by nature. So the eternal by nature soul is, again, against orthodox teaching, against the biblical concept, and against the historicity of the Israelites and what was rendered unto them given Scripture. Alright, and revelation as well. It's not just Scripture, but the apostolic tradition. And all of this is against his eternal by nature soul. Nonsense. The eternal mind is the unmoved prime mover in Aristotelian metaphysics/philosophy. So that was a quick overview of where the philosophy comes from, the story of the Greek philosophers. We covered Epicureanism, skepticism, and a little bit of Gnosticism. We covered the differences between pre-schism West and pre-schism East. Again, don't conflate that with Catholic and Orthodox in modern day. And we discussed Plato's theory of forms, theory of knowledge, the ontological existence of forms which transcend particulars. Aristotle says no, they're within particulars. Plato believed in extreme transcendentals, and Aristotle more of a materialist and a realist. So those are some of the major differences between them. Oh, and the striking dualism of Manichaeism is usually rejected by Aristotle, who, even though he says the soul is eternal and immortal, it is not in any way superior ontologically than the physical body, but rather man is a composite of both, not just a soul inhabiting a shell, ghost in a shell, whatever. So that's the main thing. Tomorrow, on the next topic, or maybe not tomorrow, I do a podcast. We'll be doing Stoicism, comparing it to the two prior ideologies we just listened to, and then good old Neoplatonism. Within Stoicism, we're gonna be looking at a dynamic reason. We're gonna look at Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, move more into Middle Stoicism and Middle Platonism, and then an episode just on Neoplatonism. So thank you guys for listening to Regime Podcast. This has been Greek philosophy, Plato versus Aristotle.